Hey everyone, welcome back. You know that feeling when you just want to hit the reset button on life? New job, new city, heck, even a new haircut. We've all been there, and you guys have been thinking about this too because you sent us this really interesting YouTube video.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah. It's called Why Do We Want to Restart So Much? The Psychology of Big Plans from the channel Dreamium. So today, we're going to dive into the psychology of those urges to reinvent ourselves, why those big plans often sort of fizzle out, and most importantly, how to make those changes stick for good.
I love this topic. I mean, who hasn't felt that urge to just wipe the slate clean and start over?
Seriously, why are we constantly chasing these fresh starts? What's going on in our brains?
Well, it's actually a real thing. It's called the reset effect. And it's this tendency we have to link our big goals and aspirations to those symbolic dates on the calendar.
Yeah.
New Year's, birthdays even.
Mondays, oh my gosh, Mondays.
Exactly. Mondays. We see these dates as these psychological triggers, almost like hitting the reset button on a video game, right? A chance to become the best version of ourselves.
Okay, that makes total sense. So my ever-expanding Monday to-do list is basically me trying to reset.
Pretty much. But here's the thing. The video also pointed out how that fresh start feeling can sometimes set us up for failure. We get so caught up in the excitement of a new beginning that we set these huge goals without thinking about the nitty-gritty of making them happen.
Yeah, it's we forget that life happens, right?
Exactly. Life happens. Fatigue, unexpected events, old habits creeping back in. It all adds up.
The video actually used the example of gym resolution. You know how we picture ourselves working out every day, but then life gets in the way?
Right. And then we feel like we failed, which can be super demotivating and lead to abandoning the goal altogether.
So how do we break free from that cycle? The video talked about setting SMART goals, specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound. But does that mean those big dreams are just off the table?
Not at all. It's more about breaking those big dreams down into smaller, more manageable steps.
Got it. So instead of saying, I'm going to be healthier, a SMART goal might be something like, I'll walk for 30 minutes 3 times a week for the next month.
Exactly. And the beauty of specific goals like that is you can track your progress, celebrate those small wins, and stay motivated even when that initial excitement wears off.
It's like setting yourself up for success instead of setting yourself up to feel like you're failing, right?
Exactly. And speaking of steps, this leads us to another important concept from the video, habit loops. These are the often unconscious patterns of behavior that shape our daily lives.
So those things we do on autopilot without even thinking about it.
Exactly. And understanding how those habit loops work, the cue, the routine, and the reward can be a game changer when it comes to creating lasting change.
Okay, so how do we actually hack those habit loops to work for us, not against us? The video used the example of wanting to read more. How would that work?
Well, let's say you want to make reading a regular habit. You could start by placing a book on your nightstand. That becomes your visual cue.
Oh, I like that.
Right. Then the routine could be reading for just 10 pages before bed each night.
Makes it feel less daunting than saying, I need to read more.
Total. And then the reward, that feeling of accomplishment or just enjoying a good story. Simple but effective.
I love that example. It seems like a lot of this comes down to being more mindful of our actions and how we set ourselves up for success.
Absolutely. And speaking of setting ourselves up for success, we can't forget the importance of self-compassion, especially when we hit those inevitable bumps in the road.
Yeah, that's a big one. I know I struggle with being way too hard on myself when I mess up.
I think we all do to some extent, but beating ourselves up over setbacks just makes us less likely to stick with our goals in the long run.
So how do we cultivate that self-compassion? What does that look like in practice?
It's about reframing our mistakes as opportunities to learn and grow.
Okay, so instead of thinking, I messed up, I'm a failure, it's more about asking, what can I learn from this and how can I do better?
Exactly. And remembering that change takes time and effort.
And being kind to ourselves along the way.
Absolutely. Self-compassion is key. It helps us stay motivated and keeps us moving forward, even when things get tough.
Well, this has been an awesome deep dive already. We've covered so much ground: the reset effect, SMART goals, habit loops, self-compassion. It's amazing how all these pieces fit together.
It really is. It's like we're uncovering this whole blueprint for how to create lasting change in our lives. And it's not just about individual goals either.
No, what do you mean?
Well, think about how often we see this reset effect playing out on a much larger scale. Like new political administrations promising big changes, companies launching huge initiatives, even societies striving for a fresh start.
Oh, wow. That's a really interesting way to think about it. So are you saying those large-scale resets are doomed to fail too?
Not necessarily, but by understanding the psychology behind them, we can approach those big changes with a more critical eye. Ask those important questions. Are the goals clearly defined? Are the timelines realistic? And are we prepared to put in the consistent effort required to actually make them happen?
It sounds like those same principles of setting smart goals, building sustainable habits, and embracing self-compassion apply whether we're talking about individual growth or changing the world.
Absolutely. And the more we understand those patterns, the better equipped we are to navigate the complexities of change, both in our personal lives and in the world around us.
This is so thought-provoking. I'm already thinking about all the ways these ideas apply to my own life.
Me too. It's really fascinating stuff.
It's so interesting to think about how these psychological principles play out, not just in our own lives, but like you said, on a bigger scale too.
Yeah, it really makes you think about how we approach change on all levels.
Absolutely. But for now, let's bring it back to our listeners and those personal goals we were talking about earlier. What's one key takeaway they can apply to their own lives right now?
Well, I'd say one of the most important things to remember is the power of small, consistent action. It's easy to get caught up in those big, dramatic resolutions.
New year, new me.
Yeah, exactly. But real lasting change usually happens through those small, everyday choices we make.
It's like those daily habits that we build over time. They really shape where we end up.
Exactly. And that's why understanding habit loops is so important. By consciously designing our routines and environment, we can make it easier to stick to those positive choices.
It's like building a staircase to our goals, one step at a time.
I love that analogy, one step at a time. And of course, we have to remember to be kind to ourselves along the way. We're all human. We're going to mess up sometimes.
Yeah, that's a big one for me. I tend to get really down on myself when I don't stick to something perfectly.
I think a lot of us do.
Yeah.
But beating ourselves up over those setbacks just makes us less likely to keep going.
So how can we cultivate that self-compassion, especially when we feel like we stumbled?
Well, it's about shifting our perspective. Instead of seeing those setbacks as failures, we can reframe them as opportunities to learn and grow.
Okay, so instead of thinking, oh, I messed up, I'm a failure, it's more about asking, what can I learn from this? How can I approach this differently next time?
Exactly. It's about being curious and understanding rather than judgment. Treating ourselves with the same kindness we would offer a friend who's going through a similar challenge.
That's such a good point. We're often way harder on ourselves than we would ever be on someone else.
Right. So why not extend that same compassion inward? It can make a huge difference in how we approach our goals and how we handle those inevitable setbacks.
This has been so eye-opening. It's amazing how all these concepts we've talked about connect back to self-compassion.
I know, right? It's really all about understanding ourselves and creating a supportive inner environment for growth.
And speaking of growth, you mentioned earlier that these ideas apply to bigger systems, too, not just personal goals. What did you mean by that?
Well, think about how often we see this reset effect playing out in organizations or even entire societies.
Yeah.
Like a new government coming in and promising sweeping changes.
Right.
Or a company launching a big new initiative.
Oh, wow. Yeah, I see what you mean. It's like that same desire for a clean slate and a fresh start, but on a much grander scale.
Exactly. And just like with personal goals, those big systemic changes often come with a lot of hype and excitement. But the real challenge is following through and making those changes stick.
So are you saying those large-scale resets are also doomed to fail?
Not necessarily. But by understanding the psychology behind them, we can be more realistic about what it takes to create lasting change.
So it's not just about those big pronouncements and promises. It's about having a clear plan, being willing to adapt, and putting in the consistent effort to make those changes happen.
Exactly. And that goes for any kind of change, whether it's personal or societal. We need to set realistic goals, understand our habit, and most importantly, be kind to ourselves throughout the process.
This is giving me a whole new perspective on how we approach change. I'm starting to see these patterns everywhere now.
Me too. It's like we've unlocked a secret code for understanding how change really happens.
It's definitely food for thought for our listeners.
Absolutely. I hope they'll join us in exploring these ideas further and see how they can apply them to their own lives and the world around them.
It's amazing how these ideas can apply to individual change and then huge societal shifts too.
It really shows how these psychological principles are kind of woven into every aspect of our lives.
Totally. But let's bring it back to our listeners for a sec. What's one big takeaway they can apply to their own lives right now after exploring all this stuff about fresh start?
I'd say the most important thing is remembering that real change often happens in those small everyday moments. It's about those consistent actions, not necessarily the big dramatic one.
It's like those little habits we build day after day that really add up over time.
Exactly. And that's where understanding those habit loops comes in. By consciously designing our environment and routines, we can kind of nudge ourselves towards those positive choices more easily.
It's like we're creating a path for ourselves, one small step at a time.
Exactly. And of course, we have to remember to be patient with ourselves along the way. Nobody's perfect. We're all going to stumble from time to time.
Oh, yeah, I definitely struggle with that sometimes. Like, I get so frustrated with myself when I don't stick to something perfect.
I think we all do, right?
Yeah.
But beating ourselves up over those slip-ups just makes it harder to keep going.
So how can we cultivate that self-compassion, especially when we're feeling kind of discouraged?
It's about reframing those setbacks as opportunities to learn. Instead of seeing them as failures, we can ask ourselves, okay, what can I learn from this? How can I adjust my approach moving forward?
So it's more about being curious and understanding than being like super critical of ourselves?
Exactly. And remembering that we're all a work in progress, right? Change takes time and effort, and it's not always going to be a linear path.
It's like giving ourselves permission to mess up and learn from those mistakes.
Exactly. We need to be our own best cheerleader, especially when things get tough.
This whole conversation has been so insightful. We've covered so much. The reset effect, SMART goals, habit loops, self-compassion. It's amazing how it all ties together.
It really is. It's like we've uncovered this whole roadmap for creating lasting change in our lives and beyond.
And speaking of beyond, you mentioned earlier how these ideas can apply to bigger systems too, not just individual goals.
Right, like we talked about how those same patterns of the reset effect play out in organizations, governments, even whole societies.
It's like that same desire for a clean slate and a fresh start, but on a much larger scale.
Exactly. And just like with personal goals, those large-scale changes often come with a lot of big promises and grand visions. But the real work lies in actually implementing those changes and making them stick.
So it sounds like whether we're talking about changing our own habits or changing the world, those same principles apply. We need to set realistic goals, understand how our habits work, and most importantly, be kind to ourselves throughout the process.
Absolutely. It all comes back to those core principles.
Well, this has been an incredible deep dive into the psychology of fresh starts. We've learned so much about why we crave those new beginnings, how to set ourselves up for success, and the importance of being kind to ourselves along the way.
It's been a pleasure exploring these ideas with you. I hope our listeners are feeling inspired to approach their own goals with a renewed sense of purpose and a whole lot of self-compassion.
And as we wrap up today, I want to leave everyone with one final thought to ponder. We talked about how the reset effect can show up in our personal life and in those bigger systems around us. So I'd encourage you to take a look at the world around you, your community, your workplace, even the global stage, and ask yourself, are we setting ourselves up for success? Are we learning from our past? And are we approaching change with a healthy dose of both optimism and realism?
Those are great questions to reflect on. And I think the more we understand these psychological dynamics at play, the better equipped we are to create lasting positive change in our lives and in the world around us.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, everyone. We hope you've gained some valuable insights and feel inspired to embrace those fresh starts with a little more awareness and a lot more kindness towards yourself. Until next time, keep diving deep, keep exploring.